The sound of water trickling into the sink echoed through the quiet kitchen, broken only by the soft sobs of a little girl whose hands were raw from scrubbing plates that seemed endless. In the golden daylight streaming through the small window, her tears glistened on her cheeks as she whispered to herself that her hands hurt, but she dared not stop. Behind her, the clinking of silverware on the table reminded her that dinner still had to be prepared, that everything had to be spotless, or else her mother's sharp voice would cut deeper than any wound. At only 8 years old, she had become more of a servant than a child, her days filled with chores that weighed far heavier than her small shoulders could bear. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in the power of love to change lives, please take a moment right now to like this video, share it with others, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to Kindness Corner. Your support helps us continue spreading meaningful, emotional stories that touch the heart. The girl's name was Emma. She had once been a bright, carefree child who loved painting rainbows and chasing butterflies in the garden, but those days felt like another lifetime. Ever since her parents' marriage had started crumbling, her world had become filled with responsibilities far beyond her years. Her mother, a striking woman who often cared more about appearances and parties than her own children, had started pushing Emma into doing household work while she herself drifted into the world of glamorous dresses, cocktails, and social gossip. Emma's older brother, Daniel, only 10 years old, tried to help when he could, but his mother always found ways to excuse him, claiming boys should not do such chores. It was Emma who was left standing at the sink, her tiny hands plunged into icy water, scrubbing dishes until her skin burned. Her father, Mr. Anderson, was a millionaire businessman, but to Emma, he was simply Daddy. He had once been her hero, the man who carried her on his shoulders, who told her bedtime stories even when he came home late, and who promised her that nothing in the world would ever hurt her. But lately, he had become more of a stranger, always gone, buried in meetings, contracts, and long trips that kept him away from home for weeks at a time. He thought his family was well cared for in the mansion he had built, with its shiny kitchen, endless rooms, and expensive furniture. What he did not know was that inside those walls, his little girl's laughter had been replaced by tears. On that particular afternoon, Emma's hands trembled as she washed plate after plate, her tears mixing with the soap bubbles. She whispered softly, "My hands hurt, Mommy," but her mother, dressed in a dazzling red gown as if preparing for a night out, snapped at her to stop whining and keep working. Daniel sat at the dining table, setting forks in silence, his eyes darting toward his sister with sympathy but fear keeping him from speaking. The weight of the atmosphere pressed down on the room, until a sudden sound of the front door unlocking shifted everything. It was her father. He had returned earlier than expected, a surprise no one saw coming. He stepped into the house with his usual air of authority, a leather briefcase in hand, his suit sharp and his tie neatly knotted. But as he walked into the kitchen doorway, ready to call out a greeting, his eyes froze on the scene before him. His daughter, his precious little girl, stood on tiptoe at the sink, her dress damp, her tiny fingers red from scrubbing, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. His wife, instead of comforting her, stood towering behind her, scolding her with sharp words. And his son sat silently at the table, his young face clouded with helplessness. The sight pierced his heart like nothing ever had. He had spent years working tirelessly to provide everything for his family, but in that moment, he realized he had been blind to the one thing they needed most, his presence. What use was all his wealth, all his power, if his little girl was breaking under the weight of chores that no child should ever bear? He set down his briefcase slowly, his eyes never leaving Emma's trembling figure. The anger in his chest burned hotter than any boardroom confrontation he had ever faced. He stepped forward, his voice low but firm, asking his wife why their daughter was washing dishes in tears instead of playing, laughing, and living as a child should. His wife stammered, caught off guard, trying to brush it off as teaching responsibility, but her husband's face showed no trace of agreement. He walked straight to the sink, gently taking Emma's small hands into his. He could feel the soreness in her palms, the roughness that shouldn't exist on a child's skin. Kneeling down to her level, he whispered words that made her burst into fresh tears, words that told her she didn't have to do this anymore, that he was home, and that everything was going to change. That night, the house was not filled with the usual cold silence. Instead, Emma and Daniel sat with their father at the dining table as he served them dinner himself, insisting they laugh, talk, and simply be children. For the first time in months, Emma's smile returned, faint at first, but real. Her father had finally seen her pain, and his heart knew he could never allow it to continue. The days that followed were not easy. Confrontations with his wife grew sharper as he questioned the way she treated the children. She defended herself with excuses about raising them to be disciplined, about keeping the house in order, but he had already made up his mind. He was not going to let his wealth or her vanity overshadow his children's right to a happy childhood. Slowly but firmly, he began rearranging his life. Meetings were rescheduled, business trips shortened, and long evenings at the office replaced with evenings spent at home. He realized that the true measure of his success was not in the contracts he signed but in the smiles of his children. Emma, once weighed down by endless chores, began to flourish again. She returned to her love of painting, filling the house with pictures of rainbows, flowers, and sunshine. Her father proudly framed them and hung them on the walls, replacing the expensive art he had once bought from galleries. Daniel grew closer to his father as well, finally having someone who encouraged him to speak, to dream, and to protect his sister. But the most powerful change was in Emma herself. No longer did she cry at the sink, no longer did she whisper that her hands hurt. Instead, she laughed in the garden, her small hands holding paintbrushes or reaching out to her father's. Each moment they shared became a healing balm, erasing the scars of the days when she had been forced to grow up too soon. Life was not perfect. His wife, resistant to the changes, often clashed with him, but he stood firm. He realized that kindness and presence mattered more than appearances or social circles. He became the father his children had always longed for, and in the process, he discovered a happiness deeper than any deal could bring. And so, the story of a little girl washing dishes in tears became the story of a father's awakening. A reminder that love cannot be replaced by wealth, that presence cannot be substituted with gifts, and that sometimes, the greatest change comes when the heart finally opens its eyes to what truly matters. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the power of love, family, and second chances, please don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to Kindness Corner. Every interaction helps us continue bringing you meaningful stories that inspire and heal. Before we end, we have a special request. Comment below with the words, "Love changes everything," if you believe that kindness and love can heal even the deepest wounds. Because sometimes, all it takes to change everything is a father walking through the door at the right time, and deciding never to let his child cry alone again.